Hey everyone! Today we're talking about the woman who managed to charm two of Rome's most powerful men, spoke 9 languages, ran the greatest library of the ancient world, and somehow found time to die epically by snake. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt and quite possibly history's first global celebrity. Before we dive into the Nile of history, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's with us around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's discover why a woman who's been dead for over 2,000 years still gets Hollywood greenlit. Why on earth are we still talking about Cleopatra? Seriously, she died in 30 BCE. And here we are in the 21st century making movies, series, documentaries, memes. What did this woman do to become an immortal legend? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't just beauty. It wasn't just seduction. It was something far rarer in antiquity. A woman who played three-dimensional political chess while everyone around her was playing checkers. Cleopatra turned Egypt into a cultural and economic powerhouse, precisely when Rome was devouring the Mediterranean world. She made the Romans sweat for 30 years, and she died as she had lived, on her own timing, on her own terms. Picture a city where Greek mathematicians argue geometry with Egyptian priests, where Arab traders haggle spices with Roman merchants, where the greatest library in the world stands beside the tallest lighthouse ever built. Alexandria in 50 BCE was like New York crossed with Tokyo. More togas, less pizza. The Nile ran generous, laying down fertile silt that fed half the Mediterranean. Ships arrived heavy with silk from China, pepper from India, gold from Nubia. Alexandria wasn't just Egypt's capital. It was the nerve center of global trade. The harbor throbbed. Merchants shouted prices in 10 different tongues. Enslaved laborers hauled amphorae of wine, papyrus rolls, ivory, incense. The smell of fish mingled with Arabian perfumes. It was chaotic, cosmopolitan, and wildly rich. At the Mauseion, basically an avant-garde university, mathematicians measured Earth's circumference. Doctors dissected cadavers to understand anatomy. Astronomers calculated eclipses. Eratosthenes had already figured out the planet was round 200 years before Cleopatra was born. Just to give you a sense of the intellectual level of the place. And in the middle of all that, a Greek dynasty had been ruling Egypt for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies, a family whose hobby was marrying siblings and whose profession was keeping Egypt independent from Rome. Until a girl named Cleopatra VII was born. She was going to break every rule in the book. The Ptolemies were more Greek than a gyro. Descendants of Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE and his empire was carved up, Ptolemy got the juiciest slice: Egypt. Here's the interesting bit. For 300 years, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt without speaking Egyptian. They kept Greek culture, Greek customs, Greek language. It was like a French family governing the United States for 3 centuries while speaking only French. It worked for a while. Egypt stayed prosperous. Alexandria became a global metropolis. The dynasty kept its grip on power. But there was a tiny problem. How do you rule a people whose language you don't speak, whose religion you don't practice, whose customs you don't grasp? Cleopatra was the first and only Ptolemy to break that pattern. She learned Egyptian. She took part in Egyptian religious ceremonies. She talked to peasants in the countryside. She understood that to rule Egypt she had to be Egyptian, not merely live in Egypt. Sounds obvious, right? It took the family 300 years to have that insight. Forget Elizabeth Taylor with the flawless eyeliner. The real Cleopatra was something else. A fluent polyglot. She spoke Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, troglodyte, Median, and probably a few more historians can't be sure about. She knew mathematics, economics, navigation, agriculture, medicine. Plutarch, not exactly her biggest fan, admitted her intellect was razor sharp. Cassius Dio said she surpassed all contemporaries in cleverness. Even enemies conceded. This woman had a dangerous brain. Seduction? Of course it existed. But it was a tool, not the entire arsenal. Cleopatra seduced with conversations about philosophy, economic plans, military strategy. She didn't take off her clothes. She took your breath away intellectually, which, let's be honest, is far more effective. Plutarch wrote that her beauty was not incomparable, but her presence was irresistible. Her voice was like an instrument of many strings. She could talk about anything, switch languages mid-sentence, quote Greek poetry, or explain Egyptian irrigation. Imagine having dinner with someone like that. Speaks 7 languages, knows history, economics, art, science, looks you in the eyes and says things you've never heard, makes you think thoughts you've never thought. Hypnotic, right? That's intellectual charm on hard mode. And this woman was about to govern the richest country on earth, while Rome was swallowing everyone. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Rome was imploding. The Roman Republic, which had conquered half the known world, was tearing itself apart in civil war after civil war. Generals fought generals. The Senate plotted against consuls. The people rose against the aristocracy. It was a political bloodbath. Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar formed the first triumvirate, a secret pact to split power. It didn't last. Crassus died fighting the Parthians. Pompey and Caesar went to war. Caesar won, became dictator, and was assassinated in the Senate in 44 BCE. Then Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the second triumvirate. More civil war. Lepidus was sidelined. Antony and Octavian set up for the final showdown. And right in the middle of the chaos sat Egypt. Rich, stable, independent, an irresistible temptation for any ambitious Roman, and dangerous to attack outright, because Egypt fed Rome. If Egypt stopped exporting grain, Romans starved. Cleopatra knew all this. She understood her country was in the crosshairs, that Rome both needed Egypt and coveted it. It was only a matter of time before someone tried to annex it. The question was, how do you keep independence when you're swimming among sharks? Here's Cleopatra's masterstroke. Instead of resisting Rome, she decided to seduce Rome. Literally, not militarily. That would be suicide. Egypt had money, but Rome had the world's finest legions. Not economically. Rome already controlled much of Mediterranean trade. But politically, there was room to maneuver. Rome was divided. Ambitious generals fought for control. Every one of them needed resources to fund campaigns. And guess who had resources? Cleopatra's plan was brilliant and risky. She would pick a horse in Rome's race, bet everything on him, and if he won, Egypt would remain independent as his preferred ally. If he lost, Egypt would end up a Roman province anyway. It was the only shot. And Cleopatra had the cold blood to spin that political roulette. First, she chose Julius Caesar. That worked for a while. Then Caesar was assassinated. So she backed Mark Antony. That worked even longer, until Octavian decided he'd had enough of an independent Egypt. The last match would be at Actium, in 31 BCE. Winner takes all. Spoiler, she lost. But what a game she played to the end. 69 BCE. A girl is born in the royal palace of Alexandria, who's about to give half the known world a hard time. Cleopatra VII Philopator, a name that takes 2 lines on a birth certificate, but would enter history in just one. The last pharaoh of Egypt. If you think being a king's daughter is easy, you don't know the Ptolemaic family. Imagine growing up in a house where murder is a career ladder, where brother kills brother for the throne, where marrying your own sister is a family tradition. It was like Game of Thrones, but with more incest and fewer dragons. Ptolemy III, Cleopatra's father, wasn't exactly Father of the Year. He earned the nickname Auletes, the flute player, because he played the flute while Alexandria burned around him. Literally. During popular uprisings, he'd lock himself in the palace and play music. Today we'd call it music therapy. Back then it was just royal weirdness. But he did one thing right. He noticed his daughter was different. At 5, Cleopatra already spoke 3 languages. At 8, she was debating mathematics with her tutors. At 10, she knew more about Egypt's economy than most ministers. Her father began taking her to official meetings, not as decoration, as an apprentice. Alexandria at that time was what Wall Street is today, the financial center of the Western world. But imagine a Wall Street where Harvard, MIT, Lincoln Center, and Times Square share the same block. The Library of Alexandria held 500,000 papyrus rolls, the Google of antiquity. The Mouseion was an international university where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, and Ethiopians studied together. The Lighthouse of Alexandria stood 130 meters tall and was visible 50 kilometers out to sea. The Empire State Building of its age. In the middle of that cultural ferment, a girl grew up absorbing everything she could. Cleopatra didn't have Netflix, but she had access to the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. She read Homer in the original Greek, studied Euclid's geometry, learned medicine from Hippocratic texts. She was like a gifted child set loose in an infinite library. But her edge wasn't just intellect, it was practical curiosity. While other Ptolemaic princes stayed confined to the royal palace, Cleopatra ventured into the streets of Alexandria in disguise. She wanted to understand how the people she would one day govern actually lived. She chatted with dockside merchants, watched farmers along the Nile's banks, listened to craftsmen's complaints in the marketplace. Here's the detail that changed everything. She learned Egyptian, not a handful of phrases to show off. Fluently, she could debate theology with priests at Memphis, haggle with peasants in the Delta, get the street jokes in Thebes. She was the first Ptolemy in 3 centuries to speak her own country's language. Sounds trivial, but think about it. Imagine a US president who speaks only French. You can govern through interpreters, but you never truly grasp what people think, feel, need. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt from the outside in. Cleopatra would rule from the inside out. By 12, she was accompanying her father in official audiences. She'd sit quietly in a corner, observing everything. How diplomats lied politely. How ministers flattered to win favors. How merchants negotiated million drachma contracts. It was grad school in realpolitik. Her father also took her to Rome. Not on sightseeing trips, on desperate diplomatic missions. Ptolemy XIII had a little problem. He owed a fortune to Roman bankers. He'd taken massive loans to fund his domestic civil wars. Now Rome wanted its money back, with interest. In 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was 11, a popular revolt expelled Ptolemy XIII from Egypt. Father and daughter fled to Rome as political refugees. Imagine this. One day you're a princess in the world's most luxurious palace. The next, you're asking for asylum in a foreign city. For Cleopatra, it was the best thing that could have happened. Rome in 58 BCE crackled with ambition, intrigue, and opportunity. The Republic was at the height of its power, and the start of its decay. Generals like Pompey commanded armies larger than entire countries. Politicians like Cicero steered the Senate with brilliant oratory. Capitalists like Crassus financed military campaigns to profit from conquest. It was a world utterly different from Alexandria. More brutal, more direct, less culturally refined, but militarily, frighteningly efficient. Cleopatra watched with hawk eyes how the Roman system worked, the Republic's weaknesses, and where the opportunities lay for a clever ally. She spent 3 crucial years in Rome. When she returned to Alexandria at 15, she wasn't the same girl. She'd seen the future, and the future spoke Latin, wore armor, and conquered everything in sight. The question was, how do you survive that future? Ptolemy XIII clawed back his throne with Roman military help. The price was steep. Egypt became a semi-protectorate of Rome. Nominally independent, practically controlled. And the debt ballooned. Interest on interest, loans to pay loans. A financial snowball set to explode on the next ruler's face. Guess who that would be? Cleopatra knew she would inherit a country rich but indebted, powerful but threatened, independent, yet surveilled. She needed a strategy to navigate the impossible. Fortunately, the perfect teacher stood right in front of her. Her father. Not because Ptolemy Thuthind was a political genius, far from it, but because he was a perfect example of how not to rule Egypt in a Roman world. Cleopatra learned by watching his mistakes. How not to mortgage Egypt to Rome. How not to lose the Egyptian people's support. How not to depend entirely on foreign military protection. And she noticed something subtler. Romans loved to feel refined and cultured. They had a cultural inferiority complex the size of the Colosseum. Cleopatra filed that away. It would come in handy. In 51 BCE, Ptolemy Thuthind died. Nothing dramatic, natural causes, which, in a family where poisoning was more common than a cold, was newsworthy. He left 2 children as co-regents, Cleopatra VII, 18, and Ptolemy XIII, 10. By Ptolemaic tradition, the 2 were to marry and rule together. Cleopatra accepted co-regency. Marriage to a 10-year-old brother. Well, that could wait. Indefinitely. If you think modern politics is dirty, you've never seen a civil war in Ptolemaic Egypt. In September 48 BCE, Alexandria looked like an episode of House of Cards directed by Quentin Tarantino. Cleopatra besieging the city from the outside. Ptolemy XIII holding it from within. Pompey arriving by sea in defeat. And Caesar chasing him with 4,000 bloodthirsty legionaries. Amid that salad of clashing interests, someone had a brilliant idea. Let's kill Pompey to impress Caesar. Ptolemy Thuthind's advisors, chiefly Pothinus and Achillas, figured presenting Caesar with Pompey's head would be an irresistible gift. After all, Pompey was Caesar's mortal enemy, right? Caesar would be so grateful he'd leave Egypt alone. Maybe even cancel the Ptolemaic debts, amateur logic. Cleopatra, even while besieging from outside the city, knew instantly it was a terrible move. Killing Pompey would disgust Caesar, not please him. High-status Romans didn't like barbarians solving Roman problems. Imperial pride. No one listened. On September 28, 48 BCE, when Pompey landed on a beach near Alexandria, he was greeted by Ptolemy's emissaries, who stabbed him in the back. Literally. They cut off his head and sent it to Caesar as a welcome gift. Caesar arrived 2 days later. When they presented the head on a golden platter, he wasn't grateful. He was revolted. He even wept. Pompey had been his son-in-law after all, and he decided those Egyptians needed lessons in civilized diplomacy. Lesson 1. Caesar set up headquarters in the royal palace of Alexandria, with 4,000 soldiers, temporarily, of course. Lesson 2. He summoned Cleopatra and Ptolemy Thuthind for a royal hearing. He would personally decide who deserved to rule Egypt, like a judge in a family dispute. Ptolemy Thuthind showed up immediately. He controlled Alexandria and had his own army. Cleopatra was outside the city, surrounded by hostile troops. How on earth could she attend? Cue the most famous move in antiquity. One October night in 48 BCE, a Syrian merchant arrived at the palace bearing a massive rug. He said it was a gift for Caesar. A Persian carpet of exceptional quality. Guards frisked the man, but not the rug. Who searches a rug? The merchant entered the palace, reached Caesar's chambers, unrolled the carpet, and out popped Cleopatra. Caesar almost choked on his wine. Then her intellectual charm did its work. Cleopatra didn't fling herself into Caesar's arms. She didn't lead with physical allure. She talked, for hours, in flawless Latin, about Roman politics, Mediterranean economics, Greek philosophy, Alexandrian astronomy. Caesar was captivated. The 52-year-old Roman who had conquered Gaul and crushed enemies across the known world had never conversed with a woman like this. Cleopatra knew things he didn't, spoke languages he couldn't, offered perspectives he'd never considered, and she was smart about the ask. She didn't beg for favors. She offered a partnership. "You want to dominate the Mediterranean," she said. "I want to keep Egypt independent and prosperous. We can help each other." Caesar loved it, not just the proposal, but the way she framed it. Cleopatra wasn't pleading for protection. She was pitching a joint venture. The next morning, when 13-year-old Ptolemy arrived for the official hearing, He found Cleopatra seated beside Caesar, as if they'd been partners for ages. The boy lost it. He shouted that Caesar was being manipulated by a seductive witch, that Rome was debasing itself by making deals with women. Not the most diplomatic reaction. Caesar decided on the spot. Cleopatra would return to the throne as co-regent. Ptolemy XIII would remain a king in name only. Egypt would honor its debts to Rome on renegotiated terms. Pothinus and Achilles were livid. They had gone all in on Ptolemy and lost, and now a Roman army occupied Alexandria. They chose the all-or-nothing play. In November 48 BCE, the Alexandrian War began. Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII surrounded the royal palace where Caesar and Cleopatra were holed up. A siege within a siege. Caesar trapped in the palace, Cleopatra trapped with him, both encircled by enemies in a hostile city. And Caesar discovered Cleopatra wasn't just dazzling upstairs, she was brave as hell. While Caesar plotted military moves, Cleopatra organized civilian resistance. She sent secret messages to allies in the city, negotiated with harbor merchants, coordinated espionage in the neighborhoods. She turned the siege into a showcase of wartime leadership. The siege lasted 4 months. 4 months of daily skirmishes, food shortages, night raids, sabotage. The Library of Alexandria was partially burned in the fighting. A military accident that destroyed millennia of accumulated knowledge. The kind of tragedy to make any nerd weep. But Cleopatra and Caesar held out. In March 47 BCE, Roman reinforcements arrived by sea. 3 veteran legions under Mithridates of Pergamon. The siege broke. Ptolemy XIII tried to flee up the Nile and drowned during the escape. Pothinus was executed. Achilles vanished. Cleopatra had won the civil war. At 22, she became sole ruler of Egypt. First decision as absolute monarch: consolidate victory without creating martyrs. Instead of massacring her dead brother's supporters, she offered a general amnesty. Soldiers who fought against her were reinstated. Officials who served Ptolemy III kept their posts. A policy of national reconciliation. Second decision: fortify the economy to pay the war's costs. The conflict had wrecked much of Alexandria's infrastructure. Cleopatra launched a reconstruction program funded with Nubian gold. In 6 months, Alexandria was back on its feet. Third decision: maintain a strategic alliance with Rome without becoming a puppet. She offered Caesar a permanent naval base in Alexandria, supplies for his troops and financing for future campaigns. In return, Egypt kept internal autonomy and received Roman military protection. And here came the personal dimension. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. Not out of some thunderbolt passion, though there was physical attraction, but out of mutual convenience. The relationship sealed the political partnership. It lent Cleopatra international clout and gave Caesar a dose of exotic prestige. In 47 BCE, Caesarion was born, Cleopatra's son by Caesar. The child symbolized a union between Egypt and Rome, between East and West. Advanced level genetic diplomacy. Caesar stayed in Egypt for nearly a year, not only because of Cleopatra, but because Alexandria made a perfect strategic base. From there he could control Mediterranean trade, correspond with Eastern allies, and plan future campaigns. But in 47 BCE he had to go. Pharnaces the Sceau of Pontus had invaded Roman territories in Asia Minor. Caesar marched out, crushed him at Zela, and sent back the most concise memo in military history. Veni, Vidi, Vici. Cleopatra remained in Alexandria to govern alone. And that's when her real talent as an administrator shone. Without external military pressure, internal civil war, or heavy-handed Roman interference, she could finally implement long-term reforms. She modernized irrigation to expand agriculture, created tax incentives to attract skilled artisans, invested in scientific research at the Mouseion, reformed commercial law to grease international business. In 3 years, Egypt grew more prosperous than it had been in decades. But Cleopatra knew the calm was temporary. Caesar was conquering the world and making powerful enemies in Rome. Conservative Republicans hated his dictatorial drift. Old-line aristocrats feared his popular reforms. Rival generals coveted his military clout. It was only a matter of time before someone tried to kill him. On March 15, 44 BCE, it happened. Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the Roman Senate by a conspiracy led by Brutus and Cassius. He died at the base of Pompey's statue, the kind of historical irony only real life can produce. The news reached Egypt 3 weeks later. Cleopatra received it in silence, dismissed the messengers, and locked herself in her study for 2 days. When she emerged, she called an emergency council of ministers. "Rome is at civil war again," she said. "Caesar is dead, but he left political heirs. We will identify them, assess their odds, and choose our next ally." Pure pragmatism. Cleopatra had liked Caesar, may even have loved him, but she wouldn't let personal feelings endanger national security. The game continued. The players changed. Mark Antony, Caesar's right hand, took the lead of the Caesarians. Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and heir by will, claimed the political inheritance. Lepidus commanded troops in Gaul. On the other side, Brutus and Cassius led the conservative Republicans. 4 factions fought for Rome. All needed resources to wage war. Cleopatra waited, watched, analyzed. In 42 BCE, Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. The Republicans were done. 3 contenders remained: Antony, Octavian, Lepidus. In 41 BCE, they formalized the Second Triumvirate and split the Roman world. Octavian took Italy and Gaul. Lepidus got Africa. Mark Antony took the East, including oversight of Egypt. Cleopatra assessed the trio and concluded Antony was her best bet. He controlled the richest half of the empire, had proven military chops, and needed resources for Eastern campaigns. And not least, he was known to enjoy luxury, parties, and intelligent women. Time for a new strategic alliance. But this time she wouldn't arrive, rolled up in a rug. She'd make an entrance Hollywood keeps trying to imitate. How do you win over the most powerful man in the East? Cleopatra had learned with Caesar that the answer wasn't in physical beauty, but in political theater paired with practical intelligence. With Caesar, she had slipped in rolled up in a rug. With Mark Antony, she'd stage an entrance Hollywood still tries to copy. Antony had summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, in Cilicia, in 41 BCE, officially to discuss administrative matters of the eastern provinces. In practice, he wanted to meet the woman who had fascinated Caesar, and to demand why Egypt hadn't contributed more during the civil war against Brutus and Cassius. Cleopatra arrived late, on purpose. When she finally appeared, it was aboard a golden barge with purple silk sails, oarsmen dressed as cupids, and Cleopatra herself styled as Aphrodite. Clouds of incense perfumed the river Cydnus. It was political propaganda disguised as mythological fantasy. The spectacle worked perfectly. Crowds rushed to the harbor to witness the Egyptian queen's arrival. Antony, holding official court in the central square, found himself literally abandoned. Everyone had left to see the show. When Cleopatra disembarked, she didn't rush to Antony. Instead, she sent him an invitation to dine on her ship, a brilliant reversal of protocol. Instead of appearing as a supplicant visitor, she placed herself as the generous host. Antony took the bait. The banquet was a performance of Eastern luxury designed to overwhelm a Roman known for his love of feasting. Golden tables, exotic foods, rare wines, virtuoso musicians, all lit by thousands of lanterns casting a hypnotic glow. But the true spectacle was Cleopatra. She spoke about the campaign against the Parthians, about Eastern administration, about the spice trade. She showed mastery of the issues Antony cared about. She offered resources he lacked. She suggested strategies he hadn't thought of. Antony was spellbound. Like Caesar before him, he was used to dealing with limited Romans, and now he was talking with a woman who knew things he didn't. The next morning, he canceled his official agenda to spend the day on Cleopatra's ship. Then he canceled the week, then the month. The Cleopatra-Caesar alliance had worked through mutual convenience laced with intellectual respect. The Cleopatra-Antony alliance would be messier. Real passion mixed with political necessity. Antony wasn't the cold calculator Caesar had been. He was emotional, generous, impulsive. Exactly the kind of man Cleopatra knew how to handle. But also the kind who could genuinely fall in love. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony married in an Egyptian ceremony in Alexandria. Rome didn't recognize the union. Antony was still married to Fulvia, and Roman law forbade bigamy. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, where customs were more flexible, the marriage was accepted as legitimate. The partnership benefited both sides. Antony gained access to Egyptian resources: gold, grain, ships, soldiers. Cleopatra gained Roman military protection and recognition as the legitimate ruler of the East. Together, they launched an ambitious project: to rebuild Alexander the Great's empire, not through reckless conquest, but through diplomacy, trade, and strategic alliances. Alexandria once again became the hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra financed commercial expeditions to India and Ethiopia. She opened trade routes connecting the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. She invested in luxury industries: glass, papyrus, perfumes, jewelry, all in high demand in Rome. Antony reorganized the administration of the eastern provinces. He confirmed reliable local rulers. He set up a tax system heavy enough to fund armies, but not brutal enough to spark revolts. Between 40 and 37 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean enjoyed a prosperity not seen since Alexander. Cities flourished, trade expanded, arts and letters had a renaissance, and amid it all, 3 children were born: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their names weren't random. Alexander Helios, sun, and Cleopatra Selene, moon, symbolized cosmic unity. Ptolemy Philadelphus honored the dynasty. It was dynastic diplomacy at expert level. But while Antony and Cleopatra built an empire in the East, Octavian was consolidating power in the West, and he was getting increasingly irritated. Octavian was Caesar's adopted son, but Caesarion was Caesar's biological son. If Antony and Cleopatra pushed Caesarion as the rightful heir, Octavian's ambitions would be in trouble. On top of that, the East's growing wealth threatened the balance of power within the triumvirate. Tensions spiked when Fulvia, Antony's Roman wife, died in 40 BCE. To preserve political alliance, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, but he kept living with Cleopatra in the East. It was an unsustainable arrangement that could only end one way: war. By 36 BCE, Lepidus was out of the triumvirate after a failed rebellion against Octavian. That left just 2 contenders for control of the Roman world: Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. Octavian launched a propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra. He painted Antony as a Roman corrupted by Eastern decadence, enslaved by a foreign queen bent on ruling Rome. Cleopatra became the embodiment of everything Romans feared. The propaganda worked. The Roman Senate declared war on Egypt, officially, not on Antony. Everyone understood it was civil war by another name. Antony and Cleopatra prepared for the final showdown. They assembled the largest fleet the Eastern Mediterranean had ever seen. More than 500 ships, Egyptian, Greek, Phoenician, an army of 100,000 men, including Roman legionaries loyal to Antony and mercenaries from across the East. But they faced a fatal disadvantage. They were fighting far from home, in a war Rome framed as defending civilization against Oriental barbarism. In September 31st BCE, the fleets met at Actium on Greece's western coast. The battle that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean world was about to begin. Winner takes all, and Cleopatra knew that if she lost, there'd be no second rug to hide in. The rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian began politely, as often happens before civil wars that slaughter half the world. Both were Caesar's political heirs. Both controlled half the Roman Empire. Both had egos the size of the Mediterranean. The problem was that the Roman world only had room for one ruler. Octavian was Antony's complete opposite. Where Antony was impulsive, Octavian calculated every move. Where Antony spent fortunes on parties, Octavian invested in propaganda. Where Antony fell in love with foreign queens, Octavian married for political convenience. And Octavian had one crucial advantage. He understood that modern wars were won first in public opinion. His propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra was a masterpiece. He didn't attack Antony directly. That would mean civil war out in the open, something civilized Romans claimed they didn't do. Instead, he declared war on Egypt, portraying Cleopatra as an external threat to Roman civilization. The narrative had a simple genius. Mark Antony, noble Roman, had been corrupted by the seductive Eastern queen. She bewitched him with Egyptian magic. She controlled him through Oriental luxury. She planned to conquer Rome and turn the Forum into her harem. Was it a lie? Of course. Was it effective? Absolutely. Cleopatra became the symbol of everything traditional Rome feared. Female power, foreign influence, decadent luxury. Octavian cast her as a new Circe, turning Roman heroes into swine with her witchcraft. The Roman Senate swallowed the story whole. In 32 BCE, they officially declared war on Egypt. Technically, it wasn't civil war. Rome was defending itself against a barbarian invasion led by a woman. Antony tried counter-propaganda, but he didn't have Octavian's flair for mass manipulation. His statements sounded defensive, his justifications like excuses. Worse still, every declaration only reinforced the idea that he was indeed under Cleopatra's sway. Meanwhile, Cleopatra mobilized Egypt for the decisive war. She gathered resources from across the kingdom: Nubian gold, grain from the delta, Lebanese cedar for ships. She built the greatest fleet Alexandria had ever seen. But she faced a strategic nightmare. She was fighting a defensive war with offensive resources. Egypt had money but stood isolated. Rome controlled the land supply routes. Their only chance was a decisive naval victory that could open the path to Rome. In 32 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra set up a base at Patras, in western Greece. The idea was to block the Gulf of Corinth, force Octavian to attack under unfavorable conditions, and smash his fleet in a naval showdown. The military logic was sound. The problem lay in the human variables. Antony was torn between loyalty to Rome and love for Cleopatra. Half his officers were fighting their fellow Romans. Egyptian soldiers didn't understand why they were dying in Rome's civil war. Octavian, on the other hand, had framed the conflict as a moral crusade. His soldiers fought for civilization against barbarism. His sailors defended Rome from foreign invasion. A much clearer motivation than help Mark Antony keep his Egyptian girlfriend. Through the winter of 32 to 31 BCE, the two fleets faced off at Actium. Octavian blocked the land routes. Antony held the sea entrance. A stalemate that favored whoever controlled supplies. Guess who did? As months dragged on, Antony and Cleopatra's position collapsed. Soldiers deserted. Officers defected. Disease spread in the camps. By September 31 BCE, the situation was untenable. Antony chose to force a decisive naval battle. His fleet had more ships, including massive Egyptian juggernauts. Octavian's was smaller but more agile with seasoned crews. On September 2, 31 BCE, the fleets clashed at Actium, the battle that would decide the Mediterranean's fate. And it unraveled for Antony from the start. His ships were too heavy to maneuver. Egyptian crews didn't know Roman naval tactics. Worse still, in the middle of the fight, Cleopatra ordered a retreat with 60 Egyptian ships. Antony, seeing her leaving, abandoned the battle to follow her. His soldiers saw it as cowardly flight. Discipline broke. Within hours, the greatest fleet of the eastern Mediterranean was shattered or captured. Octavian had won, but the war wasn't quite over. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria with the remnants of their fleet. Octavian pursued, but carefully. He knew conquering Egypt would be harder than winning at sea. Alexandria was a natural fortress. The Nile Delta offered endless defensive positions. The people supported Cleopatra. Egypt still had the resources for a prolonged war, but Cleopatra had learned the fundamental lesson of a lifetime in political games. When you're losing, change the rules. Instead of fighting to the last heroic death, she opened secret negotiations with Octavian. She offered to abdicate in favor of Caesarion. She proposed splitting Egypt's treasures. She suggested dynastic marriage between their families. Pure realpolitik. If she couldn't win, maybe she could survive. But Octavian wasn't interested in compromise. He wanted total victory. Egypt would be a Roman province. Cleopatra would be his prisoner in a triumphal parade. No mercy for anyone who had dared defy Rome. In August 30th BCE, Octavian's legions marched into Alexandria, the city that had resisted Alexander. The Persians, the Nubians, would finally fall to Rome. Cleopatra locked herself in the royal mausoleum with Egypt's treasures and 2 loyal servants. Mark Antony, believing she was dead, fell on his own sword. When she learned of his death, Cleopatra knew it was the end. No more negotiations, no more bargains. Octavian would drag her in chains through Rome. It was time for the final choice, and Cleopatra, who had always steered her own fate, wouldn't let her enemies dictate how she died. August 30th BCE. Alexandria surrounded, Mark Antony dead, and Cleopatra barricaded in the royal mausoleum with 2 servants, facing an impossible decision: die as a queen, or live as a prisoner in Octavian's triumph. For someone who had spent her life in control of her own destiny, there was no real doubt. But before the famous ending everyone knows, let's look at what really happened in Cleopatra's final months. Because reality was more complicated and far more interesting than any Hollywood script. After Actium, Cleopatra tried everything to save her kingdom. Not just military resistance, but secret diplomacy that showed she understood politics better than any of her contemporaries. While Antony drowned in despair and drink, she was still playing chess. First move, she tried negotiating directly with Octavian, not through intermediaries, but in personal letters. She offered to abdicate in favor of Caesarion, then 17, carrying Caesar's blood. She offered to split Egypt's treasures, half to Rome, half to keep Egypt nominally independent. Octavian ignored her letters. Second move, she proposed dynastic marriage. Cleopatra Selene, her daughter with Antony, could marry Octavian's nephew. Alexander Helios could govern some eastern province under Rome. Ptolemy Philadelphus could be raised in Rome as a hostage of good faith. Octavian replied with an ultimatum: unconditional surrender or total destruction. Third move, she offered everything: all the Nubian gold, all the silver, the accumulated wealth of 3 centuries of Ptolemies. In exchange, only life for herself and her children. No throne, no glory, just survival. Octavian's response was to march his legions into Alexandria. Cleopatra realized this wasn't normal war, where losers negotiate terms. Octavian wanted a spectacle. He wanted her chained in Rome's streets, proof of Rome's supremacy over the East. That was never going to happen. When the Romans stormed Alexandria, they found a ghost city. Cleopatra had ordered partial evacuation. Treasures hidden or destroyed. Records burned. Ships scuttled in the harbor. If Rome wanted a province, it would inherit ruins. Antony, unable to bear defeat, committed suicide before Roman troops reached the palace. A soldier's death, at least. Cleopatra found his body and knew she was alone for the finale. She shut herself inside the mausoleum she'd built years earlier, not out of morbid foresight, but because Egyptian rulers always prepared elaborate tombs. Hers stood within the palace complex with secret tunnels for movement. With her were only 2 servants, Iris and Charmian, women who had served her since childhood and chose to stay until the end. She also brought part of Egypt's treasure, not to bribe Romans, but to die as a pharaoh, not as a prisoner. Octavian, learning she was isolated, tried one last negotiation. He sent envoys offering mercy if she surrendered, promised dignified treatment, a comfortable house in Rome, a pension for a decent life. Cleopatra knew it was a lie. She had studied Roman history long enough to know how Rome treated captured monarchs. Vercingetorix, king of the Gauls, was paraded in Caesar's triumph and then strangled. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's own sister, had been executed years earlier at her request. Defeated royals didn't retire peacefully. She dismissed the envoys without seeing them. For 3 days, Octavian tried to storm the mausoleum without destroying the treasure inside, riches that could fund half the empire. That hesitation gave Cleopatra time to plan her death on her own terms. And here we reach antiquity's most famous and most debated death. How exactly did Cleopatra die? Sources disagree. Plutarch says snakebite. Dio Cassius suggests poison. Suetonius mentions a dagger. Modern historians lean toward a cocktail of drugs. The snake story became legend. Cleopatra supposedly smuggled an asp, sacred to Egyptians, in a basket of figs. When Roman soldiers finally broke in, they found her dead on her throne, robed as a pharaoh, looking almost asleep. Iris and Charmian were dead too. Iris collapsed at the throne's foot. Charmian, in her last breath, was adjusting Cleopatra's crown. The image was perfect. Cleopatra had died as a queen, not as a captive. Octavian was furious. She had robbed him of his greatest prize. He ordered a statue made for his triumph, but it wasn't the same as parading the real queen in chains. But was it really a snake? Modern historians doubt it. Asps aren't reliable. Sometimes they inject too little venom, sometimes none. Cleopatra was a trained scientist, versed in Alexandrian pharmacology. She would have chosen something more certain. The most accepted theory is that she used a poison blend. Opium to dull pain, hemlock to paralyze, some plant compound to stop the heart, a mix that brought a quick, relatively peaceful death. The snake may have been staged, a symbolic flourish. Whatever the method, the result was the same. Cleopatra VII died on August 12, 30th BCE, at 39 years old. The last independent ruler of Egypt, the end of a 3-century dynasty, the end of the Hellenistic age. Octavian had her embalmed and buried beside Antony, in a modest tomb in Alexandria. No pomp, no ceremony, just 2 lovers who gambled everything and lost. And the children? Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Caesar, was executed weeks later. Octavian couldn't risk a rival claimant to Caesar's legacy. The 17-year-old was killed quietly. No trial, no charges. Just politics. Her 3 children with Antony had different fates. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome as high-value captives, raised in Octavia's household, Octavian's sister, and Antony's former wife. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from records a few years later. Likely they died young, illness, accident, or perhaps quiet executions. Cleopatra Selene survived. She married Juba II, king of Mauritania in North Africa, and lived as a Roman client queen. She built palaces, sponsored arts, bore children. She died at 50, the last Ptolemaic descendant. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian, soon Augustus, set up direct rule. No senator could visit Egypt without imperial permission. Its riches fueled Rome alone. Alexandria lost its status as Mediterranean capital. The library survived, but without royal patronage. The Mouseion kept research going, but many scholars left for Rome. The city that had once been the world's brain became just another port. Independent Egypt was gone. It would not return until the 20th century. A queen died. A legend was born. But before Hollywood's myth, what did Cleopatra truly leave behind? Spoiler: not just romance and eyeliner. In 21 years of rule, Cleopatra turned a debt-ridden, unstable kingdom into an economic powerhouse that made Rome sweat. Not by magic or seduction, but with policies modern finance ministers would envy. First, economic diversification. She knew relying only on Nile grain was dangerous. She invested in high-margin luxury industries. Alexandrian glass became a Mediterranean premium brand. Egyptian papyrus was a monopoly. Imagine controlling global paper supply before Google Docs existed. Her perfume industry was the L'Oréal of antiquity. Incense, myrrh, scented oils, exported everywhere from Rome to Germania. Second, trade routes. She reopened connections with India and Ethiopia. Egyptian caravans once again crossed deserts with Nubian gold and returned with Asian spices. Alexandrian ships sailed the Red Sea to Indian ports, carrying Chinese silk and pepper worth more than gold in Rome. Result? In 15 years, Egypt's revenues tripled. The bankrupt kingdom Cleopatra inherited became creditor to half the Mediterranean. Rome needed Egyptian money so badly that Octavian delayed annexing Egypt for years. Third, science and technology. Under her patronage, the Mouseion of Alexandria had a golden age. Mathematicians refined algorithms for calculating circles. Astronomers charted planets with accuracy unsurpassed for a millennium. Alexandrian doctors pioneered surgical techniques, cataract removal instruments so advanced, Roman surgeons came to learn in Egypt. Cleopatra personally sponsored alchemy. Not to turn lead into gold, she had plenty, but for medicine, cosmetics, metallurgy, research and development 2 millennia before the concept was invented. Fourth, efficient administration. She restructured Egypt's bureaucracy, taxes based on real productivity. Peasants paid a percentage of crops, merchants a percentage of profits. No more flat rates crushing the poor while sparing the rich. She set up regional courts with judges speaking local languages. Justice in Egyptian for Egyptians, Greek for Greeks, Aramaic for Jews. A multilingual legal system in a world of learn Latin or get lost. Her postal system linked Alexandria to Aswan in 2 weeks. Speeds England wouldn't achieve until the 18th century. Fifth, cultural politics. Cleopatra forged a hybrid Egyptian identity uniting Greeks, natives, Jews, Arabs, Nubians. Through syncretism, festivals blended Greek and Egyptian deities. Philosophy taught alongside Egyptian wisdom. Babylonian math met Alexandrian astronomy. Result: fierce popular loyalty. Romans faced stubborn resistance because Egyptians wanted to fight for Cleopatra. Sixth, women's advancement. She promoted women into finance, judiciary, and even military command. Not feminist ideology, just competence. Egyptian women gained advanced rights: inherit property, run businesses, initiate divorce without losing children or wealth. Rome wouldn't grant similar rights for centuries. Seventh, urban planning. Alexandria became the first truly planned metropolis. Broad streets, sewage systems, water distribution, public oil lamp lighting. Rome wouldn't match it for 200 years. Her palace boasted hanging gardens, a private library, an observatory, alchemy labs. The port expanded to host the world's largest ships. The lighthouse upgraded its range. Eighth, diplomacy. She built an alliance web from Ethiopia to India through trade. Kush traded ivory for Egyptian manufactures. India sent spices and silk for glass and silver. Arabia swapped incense for papyrus and grain. Globalization 2 millennia early. Ninth, intellectual legacy. Cleopatra wrote treatises on math, medicine, cosmetics, alchemy. None survive. The library was repeatedly destroyed, but citations suggest she contributed seriously. She translated philosophy into Egyptian, making Plato accessible to commoners. Sponsored translations of ancient Egyptian texts into Greek, preserving knowledge otherwise lost. 10th, influence on Rome itself. Augustus quietly copied her. Tax reforms, multilingual provincial administration, scientific patronage, straight out of her playbook. The woman Rome smeared as a threat actually civilized her conquerors. Her real legacy wasn't romance with generals. It was proof that leadership transcends gender and culture. In a world of men ruling by brute force, she ruled with applied intelligence. And it worked. For 2 decades, a small corner of the Mediterranean defied the mightiest empire. She lost in the end, but left a permanent imprint. Not bad for someone Hollywood reduces to snakes and eyeliner. Death made a celebrity. Cleopatra VII became a millennia-long trending topic. A posthumous influencer who pulled off what few ancient politicians ever did. staying relevant for 2,000 years without giving an interview or publishing a memoir. The process started immediately. Octavian knew he had won the war but lost the narrative. Cleopatra died on her own terms, turning herself into a romantic martyr instead of a humiliated prisoner. Rome needed to retell the story to keep its anti-Egyptian propaganda running. The official Roman version turned Cleopatra into history's first female Bond villain, portrayed as a dangerous seductress who used Eastern magic to corrupt Roman heroes, a sorceress who controlled men through decadent lust, a threat to civilization who almost destroyed Rome with supernatural charm. It was pure political marketing, but it worked. For centuries, Roman historians kept a consistent editorial line. Cleopatra was a symbol of everything wrong with female power and foreign influence. Then something funny happened. The more Rome tried to demonize her, the more fascinating she became. Roman poets began to romanticize the story. In the Aeneid, Virgil painted her as a tragic queen, not a comic villain. Horace wrote odes about her courage in choosing death over humiliation. Even Propertius, who was supposed to be selling imperial propaganda, ended up writing verses that humanized her. The problem with creating a legend is that the legend takes on a life of its own. In the first centuries of the Roman Empire, Cleopatra became a symbol of resistance for marginalized groups. Roman women cited her example to argue for legal rights. Eastern peoples remembered her as the last ruler who defied Roman hegemony. Even early Christians used her as an example of competent female leadership. Rome had created a martyr by accident. Things got trickier when the empire became Christian in the 4th century. The church had to explain how a pagan woman could possess virtues many Christian men lacked. The creative theological solution. Cleopatra was a divine instrument, used by God to humble pagan Rome and prepare the ground for Christianity. John Chrysostom even preached that her wisdom came from unconscious divine inspiration. Augustine cited her as proof that even pagans could receive divine grace for providential ends. It was impressive mental gymnastics. During the Middle Ages, when literacy was the privilege of monks and ecclesiastical scribes, Cleopatra became a character in moral literature. She appeared in illuminated manuscripts as an example of female wisdom, but also of the dangers of vanity. The medieval church didn't know whether to canonize or condemn her. Result, she showed up in contradictory contexts at the same time. Books of female virtues praised her. Treatises on sins criticized her. She was the medieval morality's Schrödinger queen. The Renaissance changed everything. The rediscovery of classical texts brought fuller versions of her story. Italian humanists obsessed with Greco-Roman antiquity began reading primary sources instead of merely repeating Roman propaganda. And they discovered the real woman was more interesting than the mythic version. Petrarch wrote sonnets about her intelligence. Boccaccio included her in De Mulieribus Claris, on famous women, as an example of effective female leadership. Renaissance artists portrayed her as a patron of the arts, not just an exotic seductress. The total breakthrough came with Shakespeare. Antony and Cleopatra, 1607, revolutionized Europe's perception of her. Shakespeare ignored Roman propaganda and created a complex character, a shrewd politician, passionate lover, competent leader, vulnerable woman, all at once, without contradiction. Shakespeare's Cleopatra spoke like a stateswoman. I have immortal longings in me. She died like a queen. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. She was human and divine, powerful and fragile, calculating and romantic. Europe was obsessed. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment and an obsession with rationality. Philosophers like Voltaire used Cleopatra to argue that women could govern as well as men, a radical claim when most European countries barred female succession. Montesquieu analyzed her administrative reforms as a model of enlightened government. Diderot included her in the Encyclopédie as an example of leadership based on merit, not brute force. The French Revolution adopted Cleopatra as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Jacobins compared her to revolutionary leaders who preferred death to submission. Napoleon, obsessed with Alexander the Great, also identified with Egypt's last independent government. The 19th century was the golden age of Cleopatra mania. European archaeologists flooded Egypt in search of traces of her. Artists painted hundreds of scenes from her life. Composers wrote operas based on her story. But it was the invention of cinema that turned Cleopatra into the definitive global icon. 17. Theda Bara starred in the first major film version. The movie is lost, but the promotional images created the visual template that endures. Dramatic eyeliner, oriental costumes, sensual poses. 1934, Cecil B. DeMille's version with Claudette Colbert set the Hollywood standard for historical epics. Grand sets, lavish costumes, syrupy romance. 1963. Elizabeth Taylor in what was then the most expensive film ever made. The production nearly bankrupted the studio, but forged the ultimate visual icon. Taylor didn't just play Cleopatra, she became Cleopatra in the popular imagination. The problem is that Hollywood created a version ever further from historical reality. Cleopatra turned into an Orientalist costume party. Always beautiful, always seductive, always defined by the men she loved. Political intelligence became feminine charm. Administrative competence became mystical intuition. Military leadership became romantic influence. Hollywood turned a stateswoman into a diva. The final irony, while cinema was reducing Cleopatra to a sexy caricature, modern archaeology was uncovering evidence of her real achievements. Papyri found in the 20th century confirmed economic reforms. Excavations revealed architectural projects. Coin analysis proved the reach of her trade networks. The real Cleopatra was more impressive than any Hollywood version. The 21st century brought historiographical revision. Feminist scholars re-examined ancient sources with a critical eye. They found that much of what we know about her comes from later Roman propaganda, not contemporary witnesses. Result, her image keeps evolving. No longer an exotic seductress or romantic victim, but a competent political leader who governed the Mediterranean's last independent kingdom for 2 decades. The cultural impact continues. In 2023, Netflix released a documentary portraying Cleopatra as African, sparking an international controversy over racial representation in antiquity. The debate showed she still ignites passions 2,000 years later. Why does Cleopatra remain fascinating? First, she represents female empowerment before feminism existed. She ruled competently in a male-dominated era. She used intellect to offset physical disadvantage. She died on her own terms rather than accept humiliation. Second, her story bridges East and West. Greek by origin, Egyptian by choice, Roman by necessity. She personified ancient world globalization in a single figure. Third, she combined political power with epic romance. She loved 2 of the most powerful men of her time. But love didn't diminish her political competence. She was a leader first, a lover second. Fourth, her death marks the end of an era. The last Hellenistic ruler, the last independent pharaoh, the last Eastern resistance to Roman hegemony. With her died the multicentric world that had existed since Alexander. Fifth, she defies categorization. Not just a queen, not just an intellectual, not just a lover. She was all of them simultaneously without contradiction. A complexity that fascinates because it mirrors human complexity. Cleopatra's real legacy isn't Hollywood films or romantic operas. It's proof that competent leadership transcends gender and origin. In an age when modern politicians struggle to govern for 4 years, she ruled a multi-ethnic empire for 2 decades, and did so while speaking 9 languages, reforming the economy, sponsoring science, building international alliances, creating a unified cultural identity, and defending national independence against the superpower of her day. Not bad for someone most people know only as the one with the snakes and the eyeliner. Cleopatra's shadow is long because she was more than a queen. She was the prototype of modern global leadership, multilingual politician, patron of science, cultural bridge builder, economic reformer, military strategist, diplomatic innovator. 2,000 years later, we're still trying to catch up.